Okay, it's just another Schematic Monday, so we're chilling. Thanks for coming out to the Rocky Mountain Angular meetup. Quick show of hands, who's done any development with Angular schematics? Got it. Kevin, Ron, you did some? Cool, man. And you played with it last night. Yeah. So he's like, yeah. Cool. I do want to. I don't have a slide on this, but I was kind of talking to Anthony about this. So this is definitely a topic that's, I think, very related to Angular, but we're actually not going to be doing any Angular tonight, right? So the schematics uses kind of its own library, its own CLI. It's kind of this whole little animal that lives alongside of Angular and is developed alongside of Angular at Google. And so everybody knows what schematics are, right? Or should I go into that first? We're good? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, let's dive in. Jessica already introduced me, but I'm the CTO here at Brebook, and as you just heard, I just recently became a Google Developer Expert in Angular. Before I get started, I've been doing this lately with some of my talks. I want to thank some people because a lot of the content you're going to see that I'm going to present on, obviously, I've learned it from a lot of other people. I've followed other people. I've read a lot of articles. So definitely a big thank you to Hans and the Angular team for schematics. Kevin, sitting right up here in the front left, has done a lot of schematics here at Brebook, and certainly leaned on him a bunch of times in preparing for this talk. And then I also want to thank my wife, Bonnie, because I've spent like the last 3 Saturdays like just in front of my computer for 6 hours a day learning schematics. And she's just like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I gotta get ready for this talk. And so a big thank you to her and her patience in letting me do that. So cool. So why schematics? Well, the CLI uses schematics. You're probably already aware of this. So you're using schematics today. When you ng new, you're using schematics. When you ng generate a component, you're using a schematic. And so we'll take a quick look at building a schematic for a component, and kind of so that way you get an understanding of how it's done for you. And then maybe you can go out there and kind of learn and say, oh, well, I can do this on my own. I could take this back to my organization and build some schematics around what we're doing. The other reason why you might be interested in schematics is you don't want to repeat yourself. One of the things that Anthony was mentioning is every time he creates an Angular material dialogue, he feels like he's constantly repeating himself. Like, okay, we got to inject this, we got to do this, we got to do that. And it starts to become kind of the same thing over and over again. And that's where you could start to build a collection of schematics, either for yourself or for your organization, where you're doing repetitive tasks perhaps in your job already. And you could start to automate those with schematics and share them out with the community. You can also enforce architecture and consistency with schematics. Perhaps there's a specific architecture or a specific pattern that you're doing at your organization. Maybe it's something around logging, for example. Let's say every component you want to log for lifecycle hooks. So you want to log for various things that might be happening in that component. So every person goes out and like copy pastes the component that they did before, and they bring it over to their new component, and they bring in the logger and they add everything that they need in order to kind of meet that consistency. Or perhaps it's some sort of architecture that your organization has decided upon and you want to enforce that. And so we can do that through schematics by building a custom schematic that builds out these files or whatever it is that we need to do. This other one on number 4, this probably doesn't apply to most people in this room, but if you are building a library, it'd be really nice if you have schematics for your library. So somebody could ng add your library or ng update your library, right? So whatever kind of library, maybe you're building something around like Google Maps, for example. It'd be really nice if somebody could just ng add Google Maps and boom, it just sucks everything in and it's good to go, right? Or something like that. Of course, you know, I realize that most of us aren't doing library development, but you can also contribute to the open source community, and you could write a schematic for a library out there. One of the things I did, and I don't have it, I talked to David East, who's on the Firebase team, but I actually wrote a schematic to ng add Angular Fire. It's relatively simple to add Angular Fire. If you've ever done it, it's like 3 or 4 steps, and it probably took me about 8 hours to develop an ng add for it. But it was really fun to be able to learn it, and then we could break down those barriers for people that maybe want to use that library or whatever it is. So before we get started, let's go over quick some frequently asked questions maybe about schematics, kind of get some stuff out of the way. Schematics are generators that transform an existing file system. Under the hood, schematics are kind of like a build system maybe, or maybe like a generator like Yeoman or something like that. And what they do is they allow you to create files, refactor existing files, and move files around. And that's pretty much it. But it gets really complex when you want to, like, let's say, add a particular class to an import of a decorator for an ng module or something like that. That kind of becomes pretty hard to do. And you would think it's kind of trivial, like, oh, maybe we'll just do a regex and find a position and drop it here. It's like, you know, it's a little harder than that. And we'll take a look at some of that stuff. I will say this talk is going to be, we're going to kind of touch the surface of schematics, and you can really take a deep dive into schematics and learn all the ins and outs. The other thing you might be asking yourself is, okay, well, is this Angular specific? And the way I think about it is, no, not really. It certainly is developed alongside of Angular, and it comes out of, you know, the Angular community is certainly the ecosystem that's primarily using schematics. But that doesn't mean that this has to be something specific to Angular. If you're a React developer, you could use schematics just as well. You probably need to be using TypeScript because a lot of the schematics is built around TypeScript and parsing the TypeScript files and these kinds of things. But you could certainly use schematics outside of Angular. And then, of course, we've already mentioned this, but we've got the CLI integration. So it's already, schematics is under the hood in the CLI, if you will, for ng-add, ng-generate, and ng-update. Before I get into actually building a schematic, I thought this would be valuable because this is one of the things I learned as part of this, preparing for this talk, is configuring schematics. And so you may be aware that in Angular 6, we got this new angular.json file, right? And you might have looked through it and you're like, wow, this is all kind of crazy. I don't really know what's going on here. But one of the things that you can do with Angular JSON files, you can actually configure the Angular, you know, CLI ng schematics. You can set the default collection, and you might have done that if you've used like the Norwal schematics or the NGRX schematics. And one of the steps is like, oh, you have to set this this default or something like that. So you might have done that before. One thing that's kind of neat is you can actually configure some default values around the options that you pass into schematics. So for example, let's say, here's a really simple one. Every time you generate a component, let's say you're using SCSS, like the new version of Sass, right? For your preprocessor for CSS. And every time you generate a component, you got to do -- style extension equals SCSS, right? Well, what if you could just configure it every time it generates to just make it SCSS? Well, you can do that, right? And so we can configure schematics in Angular JSON. And so here is a brief example. So here's an Angular JSON file. I have got my app, it's just called my app. And underneath my app, you're going to find a property called schematics. And underneath that schematics, you can actually start adding some stuff to it. So you can add things to configure the component schematic. And you can say, hey, I want the style extension to be by default SCSS. Or I always want to have inline templates and inline styles. That's something that you like to do. Or I always want change detection to be on push for this whenever I generate a component. And this is kind of neat. This is not, you're not building your own schematic, but you can just walk away with this, and hopefully maybe this is even helpful for some of the people in the room. And you can say, oh, wow, I do that every time, or every time I generate a component, I forget about it, and I have to go and change the file extension to SCSS. Just go ahead and make that change right now, if that's something that you're doing. And of course, there's other configure options for pipes and modules and services and these kinds of things. What's nice also, I will say, if you're using VS Code, and I imagine WebStorm does the same thing, or most editors that you might be using, it's got a schema defined. And so when you actually go in here, you actually get IntelliSense in your editor. And so you can actually kind of discover some of the options that go along with these configurations. Or you can go and look at the docs, of course. Oh, I guess I have another example, configuring a module, for example. Let's say every time you gen out a module, you want routing. And instead of having to get that option, we can set routing to true, and these kinds of things. So you can kind of play with those on your own and discover them as you will. Okay, before we dive in, and I hate to put this much slides up before talking about code, but I almost have to. And I reordered this deck like 3 times in the last day. But I think we do need to talk about some terminology first. And I'm going to go over this. Just kind of keep these in the back of your mind as we dive into some of the schematics. And so hopefully this will clear up when we look at some of the code and talk about the schematic CLI and stuff. So a collection is a list of schematics metadata. And there's actually a file, a collection file, collection.json, right? And schematics can be referred by name inside of a collection. And so we'll see that. And so you can see here I've got a simple like ngg, short for generate. And then I have a collection, colon, and then the name of the schematic. And so a collection, just like it sounds, can have multiple schematics inside of it. The tree is a staging area for all your changes. And we'll see there's a class called tree, and we'll use that to create files or to delete, rename, move, that kind of stuff. It's a staging area for changes that contains the original file system and a list of changes to apply to it. And this is actually kind of an important point. Let me just stop here for a second, because you may be thinking, oh, wow, schematics is just like a generator. Like, why do we need this like really complex set of classes and utilities around all of this? And one of the things that's really powerful about schematics is you can do a sequence of changes to your file system, and if anything goes wrong, you can undo it all because it just kind of happens in this like staging area, in this tree, right? And so if anything happens down the path, you don't have to worry about rolling back all the things that you did to the file system, right? So for whatever reason, something errors out. So that's what one of the benefits about the tree is. It kind of keeps this list of changes, and then we can go ahead and apply those changes and write it out to the file system. Okay, a rule is a function that applies actions to a tree. So it returns a new tree, that would be the tree with your changes applied to it, that will contain all the transformations that are to be applied. The source is a function that creates an entirely new tree from an empty file system. So we can just create a new tree. And finally, action is an atomic operation to be validated and committed to a file system or a tree. And actions are created by schematics, and we'll see that. Oh, sorry, one more. And then the sync, you don't really need to know this, but it's the final destination for every action. All right, we got that all out of the way. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you need to do when you're working with schematics is install the CLI. And this is not the Angular CLI, this is a different CLI. So you need to go ahead and install that, and we're going to install that globally. And it's at angular-devkit/schematics-CLI. After that, you'll have a schematic CLI, and that's the name, like ng. It's schematics is going to be what you'll use to actually create schematics and run them locally. So then the next thing we'll do is we'll create a blank project. So we'll use we just installed the schematic CLI. So we'll use the schematic CLI. That's the binary up there, right? Schematics. And we're going to go ahead and create a new blank schematic. So we'll call it, the blank is kind of the command that we're going to use. And then we're going to give it a name. And so this, I gave it Hello World Angular Schematic. And just like when you ng new my app or something like that, it'll actually create a folder, in this case, Hello World Angular Schematic. And it's a schematic itself. So you're actually using schematics to make a schematic, which is interesting. It will create all the file structures and yarn install or npm install of your dependencies. And you'll be up and ready to go and get started with a schematic. So that's all we have to do. After that, let's go ahead and go into that directory. I'm going to go ahead and git init. And then finally, the other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add a couple of, oh, that's right. That's why I added this slide. They just updated the schematics to 7.0.2 with the version 7 release of Angular. And so the schematics, when you actually do schematics blank, at least this was for me, and your mileage may vary, especially in the future. When I built that blank schematic, the dependencies were on the old versions of the devkit core and the devkit schematic. So make sure you're on the latest version, so that way you get the latest code. So just go ahead and install those latest versions. Okay, cool. So we've created a schematic. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and open up the source collection.json file. Inside the collection.json file is where we're going to define all of our schematics. We've got a schema up top that's going to be there for you already. Just to note, the only line that wasn't in this file when I generated it was the schema. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give it the name of our schematic. So in this case, it's Hello World. You give it a quick description. And the important part is the factory property here, or the factory option. So the factory option, we're going to give it a directory. It's kind of like, think about when you do load children, when you're doing lazy load in Angular, you give it like the load children to string rather than a reference to the actual module, right? So we're going to give it a path to the index file that it created as well when we created the blank schematic. And then it uses a pound sign and then the function that it's going to run, basically like your entry function, right? You can ignore that if you want and just export a default function out of that TypeScript file. So you can either name the function. So in this case, I'd have an export function called hello world, and that's the function that it would run initially when you run the schematic. Or we could just get rid of the pound and the hello world here, and it'll just look for a default function that's exported out of that index file and run that. And then finally, let's go ahead and define a schema. The schema is optional, but you're pretty much going to want to do it. Schema is going to be a JSON file that you're going to define, and that's the schema for your specific schematic. And that'll define all of the options that the user would enter on the command line, as well as any of the, Anthony just mentioned that in version 7, the CLI dropped with prompts. So if you go out and install the latest CLI and ng new, you'll notice you're going to get prompts for like whether you want routing and these kinds of things. So that's kind of a new feature of the CLI and schematics. And so you can do prompts as well and define them inside your schema.json file. Okay, let's take a quick look. Let's first create that schema.json file. And let's go and take a look at that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to give it an ID and a title, not really super important, and a type. And then the properties is where we're going to really dive into the different properties and options for our schematic. So in this case, I've defined a property. It's got the name of name, and it's a string. And we've got a description that goes along with it. It says the name of the person that you want to wave to. And then I can also define a default value. Without the $, you can just give it a default value, or with the $, default, you can actually define this is going to be an argument variable at index 0. And that's going to be passed in to our CLI or into our schematic. Finally, after your properties, you can also define which properties are required by the user to enter. And if they don't provide that property, in this example, name, the schematic will throw an error and say, you need to provide a name for this. And that is an array, right? So you can have multiple required properties. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into the hello world, the actual file here. So this is my hello world function that we defined in the schema, or excuse me, in the collection.json file. And the first thing you're going to notice is I get an options. Those options, that's what the user entered in on the command line interface, on the command line. That's what they entered, and you're going to get those values into this first argument into your function. In this instance, I've given it a type of any. I would strongly encourage you, and I've seen a lot of examples where you're going to strongly type that. So define an interface. You might call it schema. I have in an example we're going to see here in a minute. And so that way we get some, because it's all in TypeScript, right? That way I'm going to get some IntelliSense and some type checking around the actual options that I've defined in my schema.json and what's being used in my code. You'll notice that my function is going to return a rule. And then I have, it's basically, I think they call this a rule factory function because the hello world is a factory function. So it returns a function, right? And it's going to return a function, and that function is a rule. And that function accepts the tree, which is the current kind of state of our files system, and then the context, and that's our schematic context. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a new file in the tree. So we'll invoke tree.create, and we'll pass in the file name. In this instance, it's hello world.html, and then the content that we're going to put inside that file. So pretty easy, right? I'm also using options.name, which we saw was specified in the schema file. And in between there, we're just going to do hello, and then whatever the name is, and then a little wave. And then we return our tree. And I'm pretty sure you always have to return the tree. Is that right? Yeah. I might be referencing Kevin throughout this talk because Kevin has definitely helped me along the way and knows a lot about schematics as well. So real quickly, this is not the entire interface for the tree. Just so you know kind of some of the various options that are available to you when working with a tree. You can obviously read files, and that'll return a buffer. You can see if a file exists or a path exists in the tree. You can create. And then you get this thing called a recorder. And we kind of won't go too deep into this. But you can start updating files in a tree based on a recorded set of actions that you have created that you're going to write against a file or something like that. So that's where you can start to begin your update. perform those updates, and then commit them. Okay, cool. So this was super easy. This is just a hello world example. The next thing that we need to do is obviously we need to build it because it's TypeScript. This is all, I'm using Yarn, you can use NPM. This is going to come, the build command's already defined for you in package.json when you generate out the blank schematic. So let's go ahead and run it. You'll see that I'm going to use the schematic CLI to run the schematic itself. And the first thing you're going to notice is I've got this dot, period. And I'm basically saying in the current directory, there's a collection. And then we're going to do colon, and then followed by the schematic name. So in our instance, we created a schematic called hello world, and it's in the current directory. So we just do dot colon hello world. And that's the schematic that we're going to execute. And then in the first instance, there's 2 lines, right? In the first one, I'm going to go ahead and just provide that name right on the command line, and just Denver, and then do dry run equals false. I will note that when you're running the schematic CLI, you're actually running in like a debug mode. So nothing will actually happen unless you put dry run equals false. It just runs in a dry run. We'll do that. And then the second example, we can just specify the option using -- name equals Denver. So. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. And just like you would see in the Angular CLI, you're going to see that, hey, we got this like create, and it says it created hello world.html, and it's 26 bytes. And then if we go ahead and we cat that, I don't know why I have hello world cat. This was an accident. Sorry about that. If I go ahead and cat that, you're going to see that it says hello Denver, right? So it filled in the place where we had that kind of the string interpolation. So super, super easy. I don't think this is going to be very beneficial for you when you get to work, so we're going to dive into something a little bit more complex here in a couple of minutes. I do want to mention also that you can unit test schematics as well, which is really powerful. So there's a schematic test runner, and we can new that up and provide it the schematics collection path, and we point it to the collection.json file that we defined for our schematic. And then using the runner, we can run the schematic using the run schematic method and tell it what schematic that we want to run. In this instance, we're going to run the hello world schematic. I'm going to give it no options in this instance and then an empty tree. And then I can expect that the tree file's length is now going to be equal to 1 because I created a new file called hello world. So it went up 1. Cool. So that was a simple hello world example. Just kind of give you a little taste of what a schematic is like to build it and kind of operate inside of this schematics world. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. And what I wanted to do in this instance, I thought this was a good example. I actually I talked to a bunch of people about different examples of why you might use schematics or opportunities to use schematics in organizations. And one of the things that I thought was really simple, first of all, because I wanted to start simple, was the ability to build what I would call like a container component, right? So every time I create a container, what I call a container component, and what I mean by a container is a stateful component that will usually have either the NGRX store or I'm injecting services into it. And as a result of using either the NGRX store or services, I'm working with observables. And we all know that we have to deal with this thing like unsubscribing from observables. And my favorite way to deal with unsubscribing from observables is the take until operator in RxJS. But that requires me to define a couple of like maybe boilerplate, if you will, kind of stub out some things. In this instance, I could show you, but I'll just talk about it. I pretty much every time I'm going to create a container component and I know I'm using an observable, I need to create a subject. I'll usually call it like unsubscribe or destroy. So I create a private property in my class called unsubscribe, and I set it equal to a new subject. I've got to import the subject class from RxJS. I then have to implement onDestroy for my component lifecycle hook. I have to define ng onDestroy, the method itself, and then I have to take the subject and next it and complete it. And then I'll also need to import take until the operator, so that way in my observable streams, I can pipe to take until and pass it my subject, which if you haven't used take until, once my subject nexts a new notification, it'll basically complete all of my subscriptions. So I wanted to use Angular schematics to create a container component that was very simple and easy. So that way, every time I need to create a container component, I can just ng-gen it, and I'm good to go. And I don't need to do all those steps that I just listed off to you. So the first thing to know about the schematics when it comes into actual like files. So before we just did tree create, right? And we created this hello world file. But as you can imagine, like defining templates and files, and imagine you're creating all kinds of stuff, that can be really complex if we got to define that all in our code base. So Schematics has a really nice way for us to define files in a schematic that it will use a templating engine on. So when I say templating engine, think about like, even when you're doing Angular, right? You're actually using a templating engine. When you're doing like star or asterisk ng4, that's not HTML, right? I mean, it's a templating engine that the renderer is processing. And so a similar kind of concept occurs in schematics. So in this instance, underneath my container component, that's the name. So collection.json, we saw that earlier. Container component is the name of my schematic. And I create a directory called files, and that's the default. And underneath files, I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory called __name @dasherise, and then @if flat. So only use a directory if it's going to be flat, right? Yeah, that's going to check for that Boolean value if that's true. Yeah, thank you. And then this is going to dasherise my name. So if I gave it a name that's maybe camel case or something like that, it's going to dasherise the name of that component for me. And then I'm going to go ahead and create 4 new files, just like you would see in the CLI if you ng-gen the component. I'm going to have a styles file. I'm going to have an HTML template, and my spec, and my component TypeScript file. Also notice that we've got this __ style ext, and this will be replaced by whatever the user specifies for the style extension in the CLI. Just like if you're ng-generating a component now and you say style extension equals SCSS, we want that extension to be that, right? And so we create some of these files, and we'll take a look at the templates inside of those files here in a second. These files are what we're going to use, kind of use as our template when we go ahead and generate out a new component. And it'll contain a lot of Angular code, but also a lot of Angular schematic template code, so that way we can evaluate string expressions inside of it. We've got some if statements and these kinds of things inside of it. Okay, so let's take a look at our index.ts file for this schematic. In this instance, I'm exporting a default function, so I didn't give it a name. And then in my schema or my collection.json file, I can just point it to this index file. And I'm going to go ahead and specify schema interface for the options. And so this is very similar to what we saw before. I will note this real quick. You'll see that I called the first argument into the rule host. It seems to be kind of becoming a standard if you look at a lot of the schematics that are built by either the material team or Angular CLI team. I don't know why they don't call it tree. They tend to call it host. So that's what I did here. And then we've got our schematic context. And we've got a couple to-dos here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to validate and configure our options. And those are the options that are coming in into that, the first argument there into our function. And then we want to copy any files that we saw out of the files directory that we just saw. And we're going to generate those templates. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to chain together a whole bunch of rules using this function called chain. Okay. So inside of our function, let's go ahead and make sure that we have a project. So if it's not defined, we've got a schematic exception that we can throw, and that'll throw out a user like a friendly error message to the user that says the option project is required. And then we'll go ahead and get the workspace project using this get project function that's defined in the utility directory underneath schematics Angular. Then we want to kind of determine the path. And we can do this 2 ways. We can have the user specify the path where they want to generate the component, or we can also determine the path based on angular.json. So in angular.json, you can define multiple projects now. In the path, or the path to each project is defined inside of there. And so we can use this build default path function to get the default path for our project. Finally, we're going to be modifying a module in this case. So when we generate out a component, we want to declare it in our module, right? So we need to find which module to use. and that will be based upon the location of where I'm generating the component. It'll basically traverse up the tree until it gets to the app module, and the first ng module it finds, that's the module that we're going to use, and that's where we'll declare our component. Oh, again, this also comes out. You'll notice this quite a bit. This function comes out of the Schematics Angular utility folder as well. And you're going to spend a fair amount of time in that directory kind of discovering some of the functions that are available to you. All right, finally, let's go ahead and determine our name and path. So we'll use parse name. Again, that comes out of the utility directory. So that way we get a normalized name and path for the new component. And part of that normalization, just so you know, has to do with Windows uses backslashes, and everybody else in the world uses forward slashes. So it just changes them all to forward slashes because Windows will accept that as well. Let's go ahead and determine what our selector is going to be. The user can specify the selector. So think when you're generating a component, we can specify what we want the selector to be for that if it's not going to just kind of be defaulted for us based on the name of the component. So we could have a custom selector. That could be an option that we specify when we generate a component. Or if it's not specified, we'll use this build selector function that is actually defined in this file. That's why it's not imported. And we'll kind of build out. We'll just grab whatever the default is for the prefix, which is defined in Angular JSON as well. In most cases, by default, when you create a new Angular project, it's just app. So we'll determine what that prefix is, and then dash it, and we'll determine what the rest of the selector is going to be. It's going to be a dasherized version of whatever the name is. Okay, we're racing towards the finish line. The next thing we want to do is we want to apply the rules to our source. So we'll use this function called URL, and we'll give it a path to our files directory. And then it's going to go ahead and return actually a source. That's the class that it's going to return. And we'll provide that into our apply function. And we're going to apply a series of rules, I think. Yes, rules to the files in that directory. And what we want to do is, as part of generating out a component, you can define a couple of things like, do we want to have a spec file, right? You can -- no spec if you want to. I wouldn't say that you should, but you can do that. You can do different things like your style extension and these kinds of things. So we're going to filter out any of the files in that files directory we just saw based on the options that the user specifies. We want to then compile the templates using all these options that we've specified into the templates that we've defined in that files directory. And then finally, we want to move those files to the options.path. Okay. Take a breather. How you guys doing? Good. It's heavy. I get it. I'm trying. When I was approaching this, I was like, man, this is like teaching Angular in 45 minutes. I don't know if this is possible, but I thought, why not? I could do it. So, if anything, I do hope that you come out of this and you're like, wow, this is really cool. And I got some resources at the end, but hopefully out of this, you will not maybe know how to build a schematic and all the details that we're kind of going through. Hopefully get inspired to go out and learn and to build something. So, okay, so here's the first thing that we wanted to do, right? We want to filter out some stuff. So let's go ahead and if the user said that they want a spec, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to filter anything. So we'll just do no op. That's one of our functions that we get. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get rid of anything that ends with spec.ts and filter that out of our files directory because they said they don't want a spec file for whatever reason. Let's say the user said they want inline styles. If that's the case, we don't need that style file. So let's go ahead and filter that out as well. And then finally, if they want inline templates, we'll go ahead and we'll filter out anything in the files directory that ends with .html. So we'll just do some filtering out of those files before we move them over. Okay, so now that we've done that, the next step is we're going to use this template function, which is provided, again, by Schematics. And we're going to run against our template all of the options that we've specified. And one of the things, so we import this strings. I didn't show this, but we import strings. And remind me what the strings are, Kevin. Do you know? Do you remember?
I believe it's all the dasherized.
It is. Thank you. Yes. So built into this strings object is a whole bunch of helper functions that you're going to use inside the template to do things like classify, like to change like a string to like a class name, because class name should be like upper camel case, or to dasherize things like selector should be dasherized, right? So whatever the name is that you provided, we want to dasherize it or upper camel case it for class names and these kinds. I think maybe there's the if is in there. There's a couple other functions that are in there that you can use inside your template, and we'll take a quick look at that. And then we want to spread out our options. And those are the options that the user specified, and then we kind of created in the beginning of this. So that's what we do. We run this template function against our templates. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and move those files after they've run through the template function into our sink. Yes. Oh, no, this last one moved the files into the path, but just inside the tree. So it actually didn't write them. I'm sorry. And then finally, we want to use the chain function, and we're going to chain together a couple of rules. And we're going to merge with all the template stuff that we just did up above. And then finally, after we do all that template stuff, we might want to apply some sort of lint fix. And I got this out of the built-in component CLI or schematic. And so this is what they kind of do. So as a last step, after you've modified all those files and done everything inside the tree, we want to then go ahead and apply any sort of lint fix if that's an option that you've specified. Okay. I do want to mention some of the functions that we talked about that came out of the dev kit schematics. Just so I mentioned them, but let's just quickly recap on them. So that way, when you get started with this tonight after you get home, you're like, yay, schematics. Yeah, everybody's like, yeah, right. So that way, when you decide, like your boss is like, we want a schematic, you're like, okay, fine. Let me go back and watch on YouTube Brian's talk and look at his thing. So the URL, that returns a source. We talked about this for a given URL string, and we import that, out of the dev kit schematics. We talked about apply. That applies multiple rule functions to a source and then returns that source transformed. We talked, you saw the no-op function briefly. All it does is just returns a rule that performs no action. So we saw that in our ternary operator when we just don't want to do anything. So we just have this simple function that they provide us. Filter will filter a tree using a file predicate function. And template transforms the file path and contents using the schematics templating syntax. Move will move the tree to a specified destination. And chain chains together multiple rules into a single rule that we return out of our function. So I do want to, before we jump into that, let's take a quick look at, so here's the schematic. Let me bring this down. Can you guys see this in VS Code? I tried to bump it up a bit. Bigger, smaller, good? Good, cool. So this is kind of the default function that this is all put together, everything that you just we ran through piece by piece. And so you can see where we're kind of building up this options object with all of our options and values that are going to go into our template. Here's our